It's day 34. The TV reports have completely stopped now, but there's still the occasional radio message. They repeat on the hour, and it's never anything new. It's just the same pre-recorded message telling you to find higher ground, stick together, and ration fresh water. Still, it's nice to hear another voice. I've been in the tower for 3 days now. As of today, I'm fairly certain that I've been in every room that I can gain access to, starting from the top and working my way down to water level. I've found no one, not even a trace. No broken entry point, no makeshift beds, no signs of looting, no signs of life. Most of the rooms are full of stuff that was pointless before all this happened, and now it's just laughable. In one of the bathrooms, room 1923, I found a bath full of cold water, drinkable water. It's a bit soapy, but it's drinkable. And then this afternoon I checked the rest of the bathrooms and actually found another full bath on the 17th floor. That's room 1712. Somehow I missed that one before, but it's a relief. I should last maybe a couple of months. There's actually a swimming pool, a whole swimming pool on the 14th floor, but the chlorine level's too high. I can't stomach the water. The ocean is still as high as the 12th floor, but it doesn't seem to be rising since I got here. Between searching the rooms, I'm still scanning the horizon for boats or rafts or whatever, but nothing at all. To the south, I can see the tops of more towers sticking out of the ocean, but I've not seen any actual signs of life. The days are starting to draw in and it's getting much colder at night. I feel pretty desperately lonely.
Good afternoon to all of you here and online as we stream the session today. Today marks a long-awaited milestone as we open Cultures in Conversation as part of the program for People and Planet here at the Expo. The program unfolds over the next 6 months, investigating urgent subjects across 10 theme weeks that include climate and biodiversity, space, urban and rural development, tolerance and inclusivity, and knowledge and learning, to mention a few. I hope to witness your faces return every other Saturday over the coming months. In partnering with the Expo 2020 to conceptualize Cultures in Conversation, we have thoughtfully brought some of the world's leading thinkers and practitioners. Can you still hear me with my microphone? Thinkers and practitioners from various disciplines and backgrounds, from poets to researchers, academics, policymakers, artists, to help us address and reimagine critical contemporary issues we are faced with today in the world of Anthropocene. The program allows for a meta-narrative that offers reflection, awareness, and re-envisioned approaches as a result engendering new forms of knowledge, activating social discourse, and shaping borderless communities on a collaborative expo stage. At the heart of Alserkal advisory, we challenge conventional business practices and craft audience and context-specific culture programs and environments, while assessing our impact on society, the environment, and local economies. It is with that intent that today's program was born, and we brought Ambassador Lumumba Diaping, youth climate advocate Lara Rudar, and Alla Semenovskaya, interdisciplinary researcher, together this afternoon for a thought-provoking and intergenerational dialogue alongside art presentations by Wolf Speller and Elena Valera at our first event, Climate Change in the Classroom, Living Room, Street, and Beyond, as part of Climate and Biodiversity Week, co-curated by the Peru Pavilion in association with DP World. Our task today is to highlight the urgency for the need to acknowledge the inseparability of biodiversity and climate change, and the existence of a body of knowledge that can pave the way to avoid devastation and calamities across the world. Our dialogue is aimed at underlining the existence of this nascent and marginalized organic consciousness, its moral vitality, its political economic essence, and the necessity for climate justice, equality, and equity worldwide. The intent, as we crafted the format for today's session, was to create a condition for learning and action through alternative pedagogy. Here, I must not neglect our epistemic approach to the analysis of critical contemporary issues. Through our research process, we've been collectively and actively engaged with all participants over the past months, deconstructing paleoclimate archives, scrutinizing the evidence of all international panels for climate change IPCC reports released to date, challenging historic milestones formulae from the Club of Rome in 1972 to Kyoto Protocol in 1998 to the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, to the study of deep ecology, new animism, reformulation of planetary ecological crisis, and the scenarios for anthropocenic forcings and extinction occurring today. Our research has attempted to read climate change from capitalist, radical, scientific, and humanitarian worldviews, revealing their inseparability from social, economic, environmental, and political spectrums, all in search of co-evolutionary, radical forms of change that can shape platforms of cooperativism, allowing for a broader investigative discussion spilling beyond political prescripts amongst an alliance of multidisciplinary protagonists on today's global stage. I want to thank both Expo and Alserkal teams, practitioners and thinkers who were closely engaged in shaping this program for their intellectual labor and commitment. The timing of this program posits us with a unique opportunity for change. After undergoing the global paralysis and the remaking that COVID has brought to us in the past year. Therefore, we hope the fundamentals laid out today can allow for continued research, investigation, and change with all of you in this room and beyond. Today's session will begin with a lecture by the Ambassador Lumumba Diaping, lead negotiator for developing countries on energy, environment, trade, and global governance, and chairman of the G77 China Group, a bloc of 132 developing UN member states, which represents Global South in negotiation on reform of the international financial institutions, UNFCCC, and multiple other social, political, economic issues. Lumumba has also served as chairman of the African Group and chief negotiator for developing countries. After his keynote lecture, Ala and Lara will be joining him on stage for a discussion. Ala Semenovskaya is an interdisciplinary researcher and consultant based in Moscow. Her work encompasses research projects and site-specific collaborative practices exploring comparative governance, climate and environmental policies, and implications of computational technologies. Lara Rudar is a multimedia artist, filmmaker, and environmental advocate. She was named one of the 20 official UNB ambassadors for nature and internationally, and has spoken at numerous panels hosted by the United Nations, including the pre-COP26 in Milan. Without any further ado, it is my honor to introduce Lumumba Diaping. Please join me in welcoming him on stage. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm extremely honored to speak here today on one of the most critical issues that humanity faces. The title of my speech is "The Fires Now, Extinction Next." And the reason is very simple. The history of biodiversity loss and the advent of climate change is a history of a metabolic rift. Colonial expansions, extreme violence, exterminations, and extinctions. It is a history of the global injustice, oppression, and dehumanization. All driven by a civilization propelled by an ever-expansive, maddening want for accumulation of a staggering material wealth, accompanied by and aided by terrifying concentrations of power, both physical and hegemonic. Control of atmospheric space, the seas and waters, natural resources, expanse of lands and their peoples, and ultimately the control of nature itself. The hubris of the plutocene, plutocracy, neoliberal ideology and ideologues, corporations, and international financial institutions. Evidently, these are runaway devastation since the commencement of primitive accumulation is equally the history of the struggle of the colonized peoples against their extinction. So the first battles against extinction is not extinction rebels, as the colonized peoples over who fought against their extinction, enslavement, subjugation, and appropriation of their lands and wealth for the past 500 to 600 years and going. The beginning of looting of the East, the turning of Africa into a warren for commercial hunting of black skins, the extinction of Native Americans, the Aboriginal peoples, and inauguration of the colonial empires and settler regimes and states is clearly speaks to that. It is unmistakably the history of pauperization, the enclosure of the commons, and the brutal penalization and criminalization of the impoverished and their failed insurrections in the West, from the Paris Commune to the Haitian Revolution, as you know. What has followed since then is a great climacteric of a rising threat to the very existence of all species, including that of Homo sapiens, due to the fact that the world has been dangerously transgressing the threshold of triggering nonlinear abrupt environmental change to the planetary scale system. The rate at which biological diversity or biodiversity is lost has approached or exceeded the annual of less than 10 extinctions per million species. Climate change, CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, less than 350 ppm, or a maximum change of 1 watt per square meter surface in radiative forcing. And it's accelerating. This global warming is accelerating because of a combination of 3 things. 1, a rapid rise in greenhouse gases emissions that you all know. Second, a declining air pollution. And third, the planet entry into natural climate cycles of warm phase. The rate of this acceleration means that the Earth would probably breach 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030 and not 2040, as is assumed. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, under its subheading, the current state of climate, states the following. It is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, oceans, and land since around 1750. Widespread and rapid changes in atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere have occurred. And since 2011, the concentrations continue to increase, reaching annual average of 410 ppm of carbon dioxide. Land and oceans have taken up a near constant proportion of CO2 emissions. Globally, about average of 56%. From human activities over the past 6 decades with regional differences. And since 1850, each of the last 4 decades has been successfully warmer than any decade that preceded it. It further adds, the scale of recent changes across climate system as a whole and the present state of many aspects of climate system are unprecedented over many centuries to many thousands of years. Human-induced climate change is already affecting weather and climate extremes in every region across the globe. Extremes such as heat waves, heavy precipitation, droughts, and tropical cyclones have strengthened since 2011. Hot extremes have become more frequent and have intensified across most lands since 1950s, while cold extremes have become less frequent and less severe. IPCC's prioritization of science and scientification is telling. Remember, this is a report purely on technical scientific background. It is an aversion of the political. The IPCC will approve its reports on adaptation and vulnerabilities in February 2022. The reporting sequence needs to change. IPCC was formed in 1988. And what is clear, its first report, which was called AR1, was made public in 1991. Second report in 1996. The third report in 2003. And they gave primacy to scientific evidence. Why? Because those were the days of client denialism and the so-called incomplete or imprecise scientific knowledge. But it continues following that path 33 years now. The call for for the inversion was equally made by the IPCC chairman, Professor Ho Sung Lee, in 2015, saying that the next phase of IPCC shall be more solution-oriented to enable policymakers to tackle climate change more energetically on the basis of opportunities and solutions. So the question is, why didn't IPCC do that? Why does it simply report on the science? Its policy recommendations should have been on the table now for COP26 and the world community to act upon in improving the Paris Accord. And this is not the IPCC alone, this is equally an issue for all scientists. They must not equivocate on this planetary emergency. The unfolding of the climate catastrophe presents an acute predicament to Western powers and governments and to the IPCC scientists, because it raises many issues pertaining to the nature and essence of their neoliberal fundamentalism, economic system, and unilateral global dominance. First, ideologically and politically, the question is who and what is really responsible for transgressing planetary boundaries, in particular biodiversity loss, climate change, and generally environmental degradation. What IPCC is to refer to as unequivocal human influence is a concealed reference to the demise of the Holocene and the rise of the Anthropocene. So are all human beings really responsible for environmental degradation? Are all anthropos or anthropes the determinants of this epochal change? And are we all part of the 1 or 10% powerful Plutocene who control global economies, etc.? Or is there a plutocentric mad gene driving them? Are these alluring terms, Anthropocene, Plutocene, useful conceptual or ideological devices for truly progressive ecological global policy imperatives? The global south thinks not. We are not all guilty. The historical experience confirms, the historical evidence confirms that capital has been the driver of this environmental disaster. And the launch date is known, and the place is known. The launch dates and place were the 16th and 17th centuries in Dutch Republic. Note, it is the first capitalist polity. The Dutch Capitalist Republic then marks the first state hegemony impacting a world ecological revolution with dominion over massive lands and colonies, stretching from Canada to Southeast Asia. It was followed by the emergence of the British hegemony based on coal and steam power, with the establishment of plantations in the UK and across its colonies. The UK, we should note, is the first coal state, the first energy state, which gave birth then to the American hegemony through oil frontiers and the industrialization of agriculture. We should point out that the Industrial Revolution or industrial capitalism brought about for the first time, the transition from organic or solar economy to a fossil economy. You will all remember wood, fire, or firewood, that's correct English word, and fodder from animals, including oils from whales. The second challenge that this scientific paper raises, and that the ever worsening environmental calamity presents the IPC with, is the vacuity, inadequacy, and irresponsibility of the Paris Accord, which is premised on a 2-degree warming. Remember, the reference to 1.5 degrees in the Paris Agreement was a shut-up process. Basically, it was added so that the global south does not ask for a 1 degree Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius. James Hansen, and you know a famous American NASA scientist, opined that the 2-degree warming is a prescription for long-term disaster because effectively what Paris Agreement normalizes is a long-term disaster of global average of 3 degrees Celsius. And the implications is that there will be forests in the Arctic, deserts and permanent drought in Europe, southern Europe. Polynesia and its small island states will disappear and sink below sea level, like Zealandia, which has disappeared. Zealandia, as you remember, has a continental shelf of 3.6 million square meters. And if 3.6 million square meters can't disappear under sea level, think about those other small states. What would be their plight? And this points to an embedded Western ontological hypocrisy, which is similar to the situation of the blacks and enslaved in 1761. European epistemology excluded certain category of people not only from the possibility of freedom, but denied them the right to claim their own freedom. This is what is going to happen to small island states. But Paris Agreement advances through the 1.52 degrees Celsius is a binary of an ontological distinction between kinds of human beings. The unsaid in Paris Agreement is the absolute denial of humanity of citizens of small island states who are supposedly members of the United Nations. Article 3 of the Charter of the United Nations states the following: everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. And according to a recent World Meteorological Organization, global annual decade, it's called Global Annual Decadal Climate, there is about a 24% chance of the world's average temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius above their pre-industrial level during at least one of the years between 2020 and 2024. We're not talking about 2080. The report suggests that there's about a 70% chance that at least 1 month over the next 5 years will cross the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. And clearly then, commonsensically, within 5 to 10 years, the Earth would breach the 2 degrees Celsius by 2030. So is it wise to follow the same pattern once again? Is it not the time that we give that IPCC and Western scientists give unbiased leadership? Is it not time to speak out and tell the global North establishment that the imminent impact of climate catastrophe would not leave the West unscathed if they don't care about others? Small island developing states are not alone in their plight. Africa has the same existential challenge. IPCC, and I'm going back to AR4, Assessment Report number 4, reports that in all 4 regions of Africa, in all seasons, the median temperature increase lies between 3 degrees Celsius and 4 degrees Celsius, roughly 1.5 times the global means response. The AR6 suggests the situation will get worse in African continent. Its 54 states will face serious economic and security challenges, and its 1.2 billion inhabitants will get poorer and insecure. And the reason is simple, if you ask. All Annex I countries, which are the developed countries, did not want to heed the IPCC, AR4. In fact, the first challenge to IPCC was IPCC 1 when the chairman, then Professor Watson, was kicked out by the Americans from leading IPCC. Let me quote what IPCC then suggests as a solution which was not followed in AR4. And I quote, keeping temperature increase in Africa to below 1.5 degrees Celsius requires a global goal of less than 1 degrees Celsius. Keeping the temperature below 2 degrees Celsius requires a global goal of less than 1.3 degrees Celsius. So, why are we doing this? Of course, it goes back to the global structure and power. There are people in the rooms who makes the decision and people who do not participate in that decision making. I'll leave you with that thought. I'll move to the second important issue within the climate change calamity, or actually the gist and the rub of it, which is the question of the energy transition. The centrality and complexity of energy transition is a key imperative that has to deliver on at least 3 fronts. One is the Paris Agreement. Second, the Sustainable Development Goals, such as reducing air pollution and expanding access to energy. Further, it has to address the global South's needs for rapid development and global economic justice. You would remember that during all the negotiations of UNFCCC, the problem that developing countries have been raising is that they cannot reduce their emissions without massive transfer of technology, etc., okay? Because that will jeopardize their right to development. It means they will remain underdeveloped. Further, I would argue that an equitable global energy transition has to resolve these issues simultaneously. It has to provide energy that help decarbonize and cut CO2 emissions radically and immediately. It has to provide energy access to more than 1.5 billion who lack it now. People forget that in the global South, electricity is not a common thing. It's actually a rare privilege. And it has to provide for 2 billion more by 2050. All at an affordable cost. This requires a robust leadership from the states and governments to establish a global regulatory framework to curb carbon-centric demands and push for acceleration in renewable energy development. There is no other alternative to achieving a net zero emissions, which everybody is speaking about, without a government leadership. Of course, the issue of cost immediately rises. And I think what we need to know here is that the cost of this transition in economic terms is roughly a cumulative 6 to 10% of global annual GDP. But more important than the price tag is the need to move urgently towards a more comprehensive system of green budgeting. All economic plans go through the national budgets. Those national budgets do not yet systematically organize for a transition to a green economy. And that's really a serious problem. In addition, this should be really linked to the NDCs, which is the nationally determined contributions of different governments. My feeling is that, and I hope many of you share the same, is that we live in turbulent times. Climate justice is at the heart of what we are facing. Why is that so? Because without fixing the issues of inequalities that exist, climate change acceleration simply reinforces and strengthens all the inequalities that the world faces. I think you have seen this with COVID-19. vaccine nationalism. Until very recently, less than 5% of African citizens have been vaccinated. We have 5% of 1.2 billion. So and thank God that somehow we survived. Think about that taking place, that that Africa witnessed the same spread like in Europe. And this call has been made and will be made, and people will struggle, of course. But climate justice is not an issue that can be swept under the carpet for 3 reasons. One, because of the historical responsibility of the emitters and the emissions continuously. 2, because embedded in the call for climate justice is a call for racial equality again, and a call against racial injustice. Remember that in the United States, although we hear about the white environmental movement, the press is very silent about the civil rights and movement and call for climate justice. The environmental justice against toxics, because basically where minorities live is where the dumping hassle happens for all the environmental waste, etc. But more importantly, and this is the third issue, why climate justice is central to any solutions, is because really climate is a rights issue. Particularly the rights of future generations against environmental degradation. What world would we live, or would we leave behind us? What burdens? I want to stop here, and I will conclude quoting His Highness Sheikh Sultan Al-Qasimi. The raison d'être for our very existence is securing the rights of future generations. If you don't want to do it for any other reasons, that's one reason for people to do what is right as far as climate is concerned. Thank you. I now would like to call my distinguished colleagues, Ala and Lara. They have been at the forefront of the debates. And as young people, it's important to hear their voices when we enter this dialogue. Thank you. Ala and Lara, please join us. Do you need the microphones? Oh, you can hear me.
So thank you, Lamomba, for your lecture. We were writing lots of notes during your lecture backstage, so I think we'll be either expanding on some of them, challenging a few, but I hope that this is an open discussion between the three of us. So I'm just going to dive right in. Your whole speech resonated with me, especially your point of injustice and how this crisis is the result of our history, and that we need to look back on our history and we need to confront it in order to actually move forward. And we must, I believe, view the climate crisis through the lens of inseparability. So it's not an environmental issue, it's a social issue, it's a political issue, and everything in between. And that environmental justice, as you said, is not possible without social justice. So, I mean, the climate crisis has really exacerbated so many decades of injustice towards historically marginalized communities. And there's, of course, the issue of sacrifice zones, where the industrial plants, highly emitting plants, are placed directly into the communities that are low-income communities and minorities, and they directly feel the effects of these emissions through either their physical health or their mental health. So when there's this talk about abolishing the fossil fuel industry and making sure that we have a safe future, we also need to take these into consideration, but also that these communities are reliant on the fossil fuels. So if we take these away from them, how will they be affected? So when abolishing the fossil fuel industry, we need to create a framework that is designed with and for workers, cooperatives, and civic society, and not only listen to these communities, but also act upon their demands and how they want to transition in this ecological transition. But of course, such a trajectory also, I think, has to include non-state actors. It's not just a political discussion. Everyone in society has a role. So with businesses, organization, the arts, fashion, sports, everyone have to try and align their operations with the goal of net zero emissions by 2030. So I think that's kind of the initial starting points.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that a lot. I guess the energy concept is it's a great deal to understand a very simple matter, that energy concept is embedded in the modes of production and modes of consumption, and the regime we're currently living through, this fossil capitalism, and I'm now drawing on the terms which are used by a lot of scholars and activists. It has two sides, obviously energy, just fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal, and capitalism, which is a system of focused on profit, exploitation of labor, extractivism, and lots of other points in it. But both of these things collided have let us be in this state of crisis, of environmental degradation and environmental breakdown, and it led to many social, economic inequalities, which are interlinked with the racial and gender inequalities, and yeah, as I said, exploitation of labor, but it highlights also the deep precarity and insecurity of working people all over the globe, and it's been exposed a lot during these COVID times. The COVID highlighted that those institutions or institutional systems and mechanisms are outdated, and they couldn't face COVID and stop it rapidly. So, and the same institutions are now driving climate change, and this biodiversity loss and this environmental degradation is posing a threat to specific billions of people. And I think that now, understanding this interlinkage between institutions and crisis is a core idea to take into consideration while thinking of energy transition, for example. We are in the midst of the global energy transition in different parts of the planet. Obviously, it goes with different speed, but it means to address this emissions crisis and global warming, and yet we should think how current energy system is structured by forces like capitalism, like patriarchy, etc., and how these goals of green energy are still embedded in extraction, and we have this whole supply chain which is not just extracting very earthly materials from the soil, but also processing them in using very toxic chemicals, and yeah, the process itself is very polluting. Then shipping it into other parts of the world for further refinement or procedure or manufacturing, and yeah, it all highlights that we need a planetary perspective and to look on the issue through planetary perspective. And if we want a low carbon positive future for us, we need to really think how much of the current energy concept and energy system we want to embed in those attempts to come to this green future.
So planetary approach. Well, my work is very centered around international collaboration. I mean, I'm part of the youth movement, I guess, for climate action. And yeah, I mean, if it's a planetary approach, what's the biggest stakeholders? Who are the biggest stakeholders in these climate negotiations that aren't actually part of the climate negotiations? It's youth, with their decisions or indecisions. In these conferences, the politicians, they're all deciding what our future will look like. And of course, as youth who will experience this future in the future, we want to be in charge of our own destinies. And we want to ensure that the path that they're creating for us is a green and sustainable one that ensures that we are safe in the future, that we're not facing all these catastrophes, all these weather conditions, poverty, inequality, due to climate change. Because climate change as well will lead to mass migration around the world. It will lead to so many different problems that we don't even know about. You said COVID. I mean, there are so many diseases that are being created because people are being too close to wildlife. And so there are the diseases that are, going from biodiversity to humans. So I think that working with youth is so important when it comes to these negotiations. And I was in the Youth for Climate Summit last week. And one thing I learned is that even though youth don't have the space in these closed rooms, we still have an immense power in the negotiations. It might not be the direct power of actually being in the rooms and stating our demands, but we're outside and we're putting pressure on governments, we're putting pressure on politicians and holding them to account, protesting in the streets, creating our own organizations, leading movements, because we know that we have the power to drive systemic change. And this change is, I don't think that adults can really actually drive it, because they're already part of this, I guess, system. And there are so many different bureaucratic, formalities and restrictions when they're working in these large corporations or organizations like the UN. They can't actually speak out because they're tied to, the internal, policies and things that they can't say. So with youth, we have this freedom to say what we want and say what we feel and kind of demand the future that we want. And I think that was the biggest lesson I learned during the summits. But then, of course, there's the issue of youth engagement and how youth are actually engaged in these conversations. Lots of delegates, I don't know if you've seen on the news, Greta announced that it was all greenwashing or youth washing, where youth are put into these conversations, are engaging with ministers, engaging with politicians, to make it seem or make the ministers feel as though they're engaging with youth or vice versa, when really the dialogues that are created aren't actually constructive and there's no active listening. So that is another point, making sure that the youth voices are also in this environment fostered through capacity building, through climate education, constructive dialogues. Yeah.
I think you, both of you have raised very important issues. First of all, I agree with you that there can be no change as far as the world is concerned without the full participation of all the stakeholders. Youth is obviously a very significant constituency in that. If I speak about the youth of Africa, for example, it's average 65% of our population. As such, there's no way that a politician can silence them. If they really, and this is the important if they really organize, and that's the critical point, without organizing, okay, youth washing, greenwashing, whatever can happen. But so this is very central issue. The other reason is because, and I'm just going to quote here Ho Chi Minh, the central issue you're facing, or we all facing, will require a real shift, if not a revolution, in our ways of thinking, ways of living, and all these things. Systemic changes, and to quote Ho Chi Minh when he was asked, who made the revolution? He said, the working people, the working farmers, the national bourgeoisie, and all the rest. He basically listed all the members of the Vietnamese society. That's how they won. It's the same thing here. World leaders will, of course, push their political agenda and their ideological perspectives. But they will change once you organize. So that's one central issue that I want to raise. With regard to justice, and I am of the opinion that climate change is a rights issue. And the reason is very simple. It starts with your very existence as a human being. If you survive and how you survive, is it a meaningful existence? Is it a healthy existence? Is it an existence where you have an entitlement to to education, to health care, an unpolluted city, right to work and be productive, etc. So to that level, I totally agree that if you do not find a just solution, you will not succeed, and greenwashing would not succeed. It can work temporarily, maybe 5 years, 10 years, etc. But as you know, in developing countries, we struggle against colonialism for 500 years. Ultimately, that struggle for independence won. But it's long, it's arduous. And is beyond bites. The blah blah bites will not win you the day. What will win you the day is doing what the German youth have done. Force a situation where the Greens are in the table. And more. Shifting the national political agenda and discourse, the national budgets and all those things. As a diplomat, of course, I'm skeptical about what we do as governments. We tend to spin a lot of things. I mean, that's our, we do spin. So, I think, my personal opinion, there's still significant progress that need to be made. And it has to be made in places where decisions are made behind the doors. Take the World Bank and the IMF and their views on climate change and green economy. It's very simple. The World Bank reports are actually trying to normalize a 4 degrees Celsius world. Until now, its matrix and advice for national economies in what they call Chapter 4 does not speak to issues of energy transition or supporting renewable energy as an imperative for a healthy shift towards renewables. So that's one issue. Second issue, and Ale, you have raised this. Climate change equally affects women more than anyone as far as developing countries are concerned. Because they are the ones who actually prepare and make everything necessary for their children to survive. A worsening environmental situation basically means that if they are not unhealthy, their children will be unhealthy.
There are two things I want to add.
Yes, please.
One is about greenwashing. I think it plays a big role in this discussion, quite often a central role. Greenwashing is carbon washing, is youth washing, us having this intergenerational conversation today even. It is central and quite often jumped on because the messaging is clear and the narration is clear, stories is not as complex as the realities in a way, and greenwashing definitely jeopardizes a lot of attempts on a change from the youth movement and climate movement. But it's very important to embrace it and to maybe jump even again on this story and try to make it abundantly clear, the complexity, take it out and then develop on it. It's better than nothing. I guess it's better than silence. And another issue that I wanted to mention as you were speaking, that environmental breakdown as the complex of issues of climate change, of the biodiversity loss, it is a systemic crisis of politics. And of course, it's a technical challenge, but above all, it is a question of inequality. It is a question of power, who has it, who uses, and for what ends. And and to mobilize the new political coalitions or current political coalitions together with the social power, we need to start redefining, refining the current social, political, and economic institutions, including commons, including markets, including borders even of nation states, and many other host of issues. It can come to how we see the company and how we can make the transition, help make the transition for the company to the common-based institution, or how we can democratize finance, or recalibrate the land use, move from monoculture to agriculture, which is actually helping soil regenerate itself. And again, the host of other issues. But above all, this is a crisis of politics and their political ability and the will, I think. And it comes maybe, it asks to be put on a table. Not only many people should be involved in this conversation, not just youth, also local communities, indigenous communities, other grassroots initiatives to make this change happen. But I think this transition from extractivism to some kind of economy of care, what you've just mentioned about mothers helping to grow up their children. Maybe if we put more accents and attention to the education and healthcare, it's been very clear that it is needed, especially again over the COVID, to taking care of elderly. Maybe that would be that shift in the thinking, what we've been discussing over last several weeks.
Yeah, I agree with you. What COVID has taught us is the following: if there is a will, there is a way. Think about it this way. The very invention of the vaccine, it speaks about collaboration, innovation, and really making the necessary investment and energy to find solutions. If COVID was treated the same that malaria was treated, it would have taken 50 years. Simple. Second thing that it teaches us is that the world is filthy rich. As we speak now, the effort towards the commitment towards financing pandemics and COVID is $12 trillion in Western countries. Do you know what is supposedly the cost of a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway? It's less than 1.5 trillion. Just think about the scale of difference. An existential crisis like climate change, which asks for, let's suppose it's asked for 6 trillions, and you sit on them. Soon, United States will raise over $3 trillion to finance revamping its infrastructure. Third lesson that we learned from COVID is that government has absolute power to push the agenda forward. In the West, all the austerity and all that has been put aside because there is money and it has to be spent now, otherwise there will be calamity in their own societies. That's why the British Treasury, the American states, etc., left that. And this goes back to your issue about the role of society in advancing change. It's the society, the entirety of the whole society moving to push those agenda forward. I think we are to conclude. Thank you very, very, very much indeed, and thank you guys for listening to us.
Thank you very much.
What do we do?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lumumba, Lara, and Ala, for your intellectual input, not only during this conversation, but in the lead up to this conversation, and for the work that you do as advocates, as leading figures globally. Thank you for this engaging discussion. For the closing of the session today, it is my pleasure to introduce Elena Valera, who we have invited through our collaboration with the Peru Pavilion. Elena uses traditional Shipibo, Konibo, or Kenya design from a contemporary perspective, in which she incorporates mythological and sacred characters and beings into her artwork. As a critical stakeholder in the conversation around climate change, please join me in welcoming her on stage.
Buenas tardes con todos.
Good afternoon, everybody.
En este momento voy a hablar sobre cambio climático y la conservación.
Right now I'm going to talk about climate change and conservation.
La cosmovisión y la naturaleza y las conexiones del mundo.
The general worldview, constellations, and the Shipibo way of looking at things about the world.
Vengo del pueblo Shipibo, soy la hija del pueblo Shipibo del Perú.
I am a daughter of the Shipibo ethnic group from Peru.
Vengo trayendo algún mensaje para ustedes.
I'm here bringing a message to all of you.
Antes de eso, voy a cantar un canto de los antepasados que nos dejaron.
Before that, I'm going to sing a song about from our ancestors.
Para waratoawa, para waratoawa, iriba katibi, miyaha wayonari, miyaha wayonari. Neska ranika, neska ranika. No reka bobiri, no ashe bobiri, tana aki añoro. Irak.
Thank you.
Bueno, en este momento yo vengo a representar a mi pueblo Shipibo Conibo.
I come to represent my Shipibo Conibo town.
Nuestras costumbres, nuestra cosmovisión, nuestra cultura y mi arte. Eso es lo que vengo a representar.
I come to represent our worldview, art, and customs.
Yo pinto, yo soy artista que pinto mi costumbre, mi pueblo, mis experiencias, mis sueños.
I am an artist that paints her experiences, everyday life, customs.
Eso es lo que he aprendido mediante la vida cotidiana que he vivido con mis padres, con mis abuelos.
That's what I've learned from my everyday life that I've lived with my parents and grandparents.
Toda esa experiencia del trabajo que he bordado, que he pintado, que he hecho cerámica, que me han contado, los cuentos, los mitos, las leyendas, las experiencias que tengo, ese es mi arte.
My art is all the things that I have learned: embroidering, singing, making ceramics, dancing.
Ese arte que yo plasmo en mi trabajo de arte, eso representa mi experiencia, mi cotidiana que he vivido, es la vivencia.
My art represents my everyday life and the experience that I have lived throughout my life.
Y los consejos que nos han dejado los abuelos es una herencia nuestra, para nuestra cultura.
Our ancestors, our grandparents have left us a lot of advice that we have to take into account from now on.
Voy a contar un ejemplo de las conexiones con la naturaleza.
I'd like to tell you guys an example of the connections that I have with nature.
Mi primera experiencia cuando era niña.
My first experience when I was a little girl.
Vivo en Alto Ucayali, en la Amazonía, del río Ucayali, del bosque.
I live in Ucayali, an area in the Amazon of Peru, near the Ucayali River.
Ahí donde hay laguna, donde hay bastante peces, nosotros íbamos con mi familia, con mis abuelos, a buscar huevos de carachama.
With my family, we used to go and look for carachama eggs. Carachama is a fish from the Amazon of Peru.
Remando todo el día y anochecer nos llegamos en un caño de la quebrada donde quedamos a dormir.
We were rowing all day until we got to a place where we stayed at night, right by the waterfalls.
Ahí es donde tuve un sueño que he visto los chipivos conivos que danzaban, que cantaban, que celebraban con todos sus vestimentos y también con sus caras pintadas, tal como es la cultura shipibo.
I had a dream about boys and girls of the Shipibo Conibo tribe celebrating, singing, and dancing with their face painted in a celebration.
Lo que nunca había visto en vida, eso fue en sueño.
I had never seen anything like that in a dream before.
Eso fue mi primera conexión.
That was my first connection with nature.
En la mañana siguiente, escuché un canto con quena que tocaba del bosque.
The day after, I heard a bird using a quena, a typical Peruvian instrument, in the forest. It was playing the quena in the forest.
Y yo decía, ¿quién está ahí? Tía, abuelo, ¿quién está ahí? Lo que toca, escucha lo que están cantando.
And then I asked my grandfather or my aunt, who was there playing the quena?
Ahí no hay nadie, hija. Este es un desierto. Acá no vive nadie. Es un pajarito que está cantando. Ese canto es para ti porque tú estás en cambio de pubertad. Por eso te está preparando.
They answered that there was nobody there. Actually, it was actually a bird singing. It was in the desert, so there were no people playing the instrument. So what they tell her was that it was a message that she was receiving from nature, that she stopped being a little girl and becoming or entering puberty.
Y eso fue la primera conexión que tuve experiencia con la naturaleza.
And that was the first experience I had with nature.
Los abuelos, las abuelas, todas esas experiencias que he vivido, que han vivido con nosotros junto a la naturaleza, esos son las conexiones con el aire, con la tierra, con el agua y con el universo.
Our grandparents and grandmothers have lived these connections that I'm mentioning with nature, with the wind, with the space, with the water, and with the earth.
Nos enseñaron que respete la naturaleza. Cuando la naturaleza no le gusta algo que no está permitido, que no tenemos permiso de entrar en un lugar sagrado,
They taught us to respect nature, not to enter places that we are not permitted to enter.
eso no te permite. Entonces hay que respetar. Y si no respetamos, nos podemos pasar algo. Por ejemplo, la lluvia te puede mojar o si no la tormenta te puede hacer y también de repente en el agua el remolino te puede jalar.
If we do not respect nature, something bad could happen in the end to all of us. There could be floods, or we can be in big trouble if we just don't respect nature.
Y si no respetas, puedes entrar como quieras y entonces puedes dañar a la naturaleza, a la madre del río o si no a la madre de la tierra, que son espíritus que también son protectores, guardianes de nuestra naturaleza.
If we don't respect, we can damage the mother of the rivers, the mother of the forest, that are spirits that take care of us. And if we don't respect them, then everything will just end.
y si no, lo puedes desaparecer como quieras con algunas maquinarias, pero alguna vez ellos ya no van a existir y nosotros también nos vamos a quedarnos afectados frente a eso, y por eso nosotros hay que cuidar nuestro planeta, hay que cuidar nuestras plantas. Si es que nosotros talamos, hay que sembrar uno de reserva.
There's big machinery entering our plants and cutting the trees down, which is something that we don't want to do. We have to respect the nature and the planet. If we cut down a tree, something we can do is plant another one instead.
Porque los abuelos nos enseñaron respetar, mucho respeto había en cuanto a la naturaleza. Por ejemplo, cuando uno tocaba las plantas o se bañaba para entender las cosas. Por decir, una niña está preparando sus padres. A esa niña va a quedar sabia, inteligente, y entonces uno respetaba. Entonces esa niña quedaba hábil, sabia en todas las cosas que haceres.
We have to respect, because that way, when you are a little girl, for example, you can show your parents that you're ready and that you're a wise girl, that you can grow and do your life without any problems.
Ahí donde que llega a conectarse con la naturaleza. Con el aire, por decir, con el aire donde que viven los animales, las plantas, los árboles son hogares para los pajaritos.
For example, in the air, the trees and plants are home of the birds.
Cuando amanece, ya sabe el significado que los pajaritos cantan.
When the sun rises, we already know that it's daytime, when the birds are singing already.
Cuando las estrellas están iluminados, quiere decir que este año va a haber bastante y grande verano.
For example, when the stars shine, that means that there's going to be a great summer.
Cuando un pajarito canta, es justo cuando hay algo de comer por ahí, entonces los abuelos se iban y traían comida.
When the birds sing in a specific area, that meant the message was for the people that there's some food there. So they reached and went to the specific place to find the food for the family.
Cuando cantaba la sirena, escuchaba, quiere decir que ya está amaneciendo, entonces vamos a pescar, decía, y se iban y traían bastante comida.
When the mermaids sang in the morning, that also meant that there were a lot of fish in that area, and that way they knew that they could go there and get it for their families.
Y también hay lugares de respeto que no podemos ingresar. Entonces, si hay algún peligro que corre, entonces también avisaba que no se vaya por allá y cantaba un pajarito diciendo que está prohibido ese lugar. Y entonces ya se detenía.
There are also forbidden places in which birds sing, and people knew that if they sang in a specific way, they couldn't go inside because it was a forbidden area.
Hoy en día, y si terminamos todos los pajaritos, todos los árboles, lo talamos y metemos maquinarias grandes para destruir todas esas cosas, entonces nosotros vamos a quedarnos afectados frente de que se desaparecieron toda la naturaleza, tanto árboles, los pajaritos y los animales, y a nosotros también nos afecta.
If we take down the trees, if we cut them down with machinery of ourselves, then birds will have no place to live, and that also would affect us.
En ese sentido, llamo a todos los hermanos del mundo, de todos los continentes, de todos los países, hay que respetar la naturaleza frente a esta situación que estamos viviendo. Ya con la tecnología avanzada podemos hacer algo. Tenemos esperanza también, hay que tener conciencia con respecto a la naturaleza, no terminar, no destruir, hay que reservar, hay que conservar. Entonces nosotros también tenemos que evitar que se destruya, que se desaparezca todo y así también a los humanos.
So I like to tell all my brothers and sisters from the different countries, different continents, that we together can work on this, that technology can help us preserve our planet.
El arte que yo pinto, el arte que voy a demostrar es los 4 espacios del mundo donde que el espacio, el universo está contaminado de los negros, de las nubes negras, que no hay luz. Y entonces, cuando hay espacio que es sano, con nubes azules, ese es espacio sano. Entonces, si es contaminado, es negro. Si el agua está contaminado, está turbio, no sirve para nada. Y entonces hay que reflexionar, hay que pensar, hay que ayudarnos y unirnos entre todos. Eso es lo que yo pinto, eso es lo que voy a demostrar en mi pintura mural que está afuera. Pueden apreciar, pueden acompañarme y les invito a todas las personas, visitas que entren en la expo, bienvenidos. Y acá estamos para ayudar, para poder recibir a la gente, a la visita. Muchas gracias. Mi nombre es Elena Valera Vázquez, artista plástica, autodidacta. Represento a mi pueblo Shipibo Conibo de la selva peruana. Gracias.
Okay, in her art, she represents that the dark clouds are something that we don't want. We want the blue clouds and the clear water for our people. Basically, she said that if we get together, we can find ways to solve these climate problems we're having right now, and that with unity and working side by side, we can actually reach that and protect our planet. We have an opportunity to do that. Also, and this is something she mentioned at the end, she is inviting all of you to go to the Peru Pavilion now. There's transportation outside for us to go right after this presentation, so you can see her piece of art, the art that she's showing, the exhibit she's showing right there in the Peru Pavilion. So we have some boogies, so we can go there right after we finish. So she would like you all to come and visit, and so you can see her and she can explain to you what this is all about. Thank you.